So, I've been reevaluating some of my politics lately. Um, Back in 2011, in the midst of the Occupy movement, I became radicalized into anarchism. And yeah, I was reading David Graeber at the time, but at the same time, it was also just the structure of the occupations, this commune we had where people were supporting one another and managing their own affairs, participating in their own in this kind of radically democratic society. And it was seeing that made me realize another world was possible, and that this could be how the world works. And So that was a really transformative thing, and it sort of broke this spell of this kind of status quo thinking that I'd been in for so long. Um, but over the years, I found myself increasingly dissatisfied with the anarchism for a number of reasons. I mean, the whole no gods no masters thing was sort of obviously a no go for me as a person of faith. But aside from that, it's like there's this sort of there's a sense in anarchism that's, well, hierarchy is the enemy, so we have to constantly ask ourselves, okay, is this arrangement hierarchical? Is someone being foregrounded here? Is someone else being, this is a whole step up step back thing in meetings, and a lot of that can be useful, but it's often done at the expense of effectiveness, and a sort of timidness about taking the reins when a situation calls for it. Vincent Bevins, in his book "If We Burn," described. I think he was in Brazil. There was a march that had taken the bridge and was marching at City Hall, and the government abandoned the City Hall, and I think what he was saying is they could have actually taken City Hall at that point. They could have, there was an opportunity to seize power, and instead everyone went home. And I think but I'm probably getting some details of that wrong. But I think that there was a real instance with the Spanish anarchists in 1930s where they were offered an opportunity to sort of be the governing power in the place, and turned it down, because of course for anarchists, governing is obviously that's for the people. You can't possibly ask us to do that. But and whenever you do that, you cede power to those who are willing to take power, who often don't have your best interests in mind. And I drifted a little further. I found Murray Bookchin's writings. Murray Bookchin had, for most of his life, been associated with anarchism. He promoted what he called social anarchism versus what he derided as lifestyle anarchism, the sort of individualist anarchist of sort of dropping out of society, if you will. But in his later years, he distanced himself from anarchism and developed this idea of what he called communalism, which is based on one aspect of that is libertarian municipalism, which is to actually participate in electoralism at the local level, getting people into City Hall who will then use that power to reorganize city power structures and give power back to the community to create a radical democracy at the municipal level, and then link these municipalities together through confederation. And this, of course, influenced the Kurdish thinker Abdullah Öcalan into developing a system called democratic confederalism, which was the governing ideology of the PKK and the YPG, the YPJ, in developing what became known as Rojava. Now, as I speak, it looks like Rojava is falling. It has been betrayed by the U.S. And handed over to the Al Qaeda affiliated U.S. supported regime of Jolani. Um, and you know for uh, and yeah, as a longtime supporter of Rojava, it's a tragic thing for me to see. Um, I'm not sure I'd ever quite identified as a communalist or democratic confederalist. I was always aligned with it, so to speak. Particularly when I wasn't sure what I was, because I was still some sort of libertarian socialist, but I couldn't quite do anarchism. But so with the fall of Rojava, I'm starting to sort of reevaluate how we got there. And obviously, I mean, making a Faustian bargain with the U.S., I think, was always going to be risky. And I think that a lot of the people in Rojava knew that, but felt they had no choice. Um, yeah, but if they'd pursued national liberation, they might not have gotten it. Um, but I'm not sure that the seeking a an autonomous zone within a nation state was ever going to be sustainable long term either. And I think maybe we might have to grapple with that now. I mean, obviously the Zapatistas are still active in Chiapas. Godspeed to them. I hope that they maintain. But I think the defeat of Rojava should call us to rethink about the sort of autonomous zone as a sort of strategy. I think it's a fine short term tactic, but we live under a world system of capitalism, and or what's Hart and Negri called empire, and this empire is global spanning. It spans a globe, right? Um, and we have to look at those forces that are sort of aligned with that empire and those forces that are against it. And when I was an anarchist, I spent a long time dunking on so-called tankies, for people who defended Stalin and would lend their support to dictators and claim that the CIA was behind everything that they didn't agree with in the world. And there are some people who I think deserve that kind of designation, like Max Blumenthal, the whole gray zone crowd. I think merits that kind of designation. But as I've gotten to read more Marxist-Leninist literature, gotten to know several Marxist-Leninists, I mean, most of them are not dogmatic in their support for the Soviet Union. They're probably willing to criticize things that were wrong about it. In terms of third world solidarity, a lot of them are, there is a concept of critical support for regimes that have their problems, have their internal contradictions, but which are also on the have the gun of empire pointed at them and need the critical support as a result. And I've also, I look at the history of the Soviet Union, and God knows I criticize the fuck out of Stalin. I think I have a lot of criticisms of Lenin too. I think that his authoritarian takeover of the Soviets was, I think was a very wrong move, and I think it might have had a very different direction if we hadn't done that. But I know that the Soviet Union was a sponsor of a great number of national liberation movements in the 20th century, and I think the loss of that has been a major blow to the left that we're still recovering from. I know that actually Öcalan himself, was a Marxist-Leninist, and it was at the fall of the Soviet Union when they didn't have that support anymore that he tried turning towards democratic confederalism. Um, but yeah, like so I think that one major shortfall I find in anarchism and just libertarian socialism more broadly is there isn't a lot of like very deep thinking about geopolitics, about not just being under the power of the state, but being the global power of empire, and what that means and sort of what it will take to rebel not just locally but create a global movement against it. One person who I think did have good insight into that was Huey P. Newton, one of my favorite all-time leftist theorists. He in a speech in the 70s, he said that that the world had evolved to a state of what he called reactionary intercommunalism. That is, the nation state had sort of softened so that obviously nations still existed, but they were sort of porous within a global web of international capitalism. And he said the only response to that was revolutionary intercommunalism, and that meant being in community not just with not just with nation states, but with communities. That there are zones of resistance against empire that have to be connected together, and so and I read this when I was an anarchist, and I thought, oh great, yeah, he's thinking beyond the nation state, and we do need to think beyond the nation state, but we can't also just circumvent the nation state either. We have in that same speech, he recognized China and Vietnam as liberated zones that must be defended against the empire capital. And so, in terms of looking at liberated zones in the world, there are, I look at, for example, Venezuela. And I don't want to deny that Maduro had some authoritarian tendencies, that there were a lot of crackdowns. A lot of people don't know that also in Venezuela, under Chavez, they created this commune system in which ordinary peasants had a great deal more democratic control over their lives, over the lives of their community, in ways that actually is very similar to what I was supporting about Rojava. It was a dual power system. Now, the upper end of that dual power system still controlled the army and the military, and I think maybe that's where we need to shift things. That the armed forces should be aligned with the communes, not with the state. So there's a lot I think needs to be done, but I think instead of looking beyond to get beyond the nation state, I think I had to not just look at like subnational movements like autonomous zones, but also supranational movements of like what Pan-Africanists see in Africa. Uniting a bunch of nations together to share resources, to share economic power and share political power, and then within those zones, creating that communal power at a local level. So that we help create the new world and shell the old. There's in the anarchist sentiment that all states are bad is true in an ultimate sense, but we need the subtlety to recognize that they also exist within a system of empire in which nationhood is actually you're required in order to obtain certain protections and to have a certain defense against more powerful states. So I think there's this need for global revolutionary struggle can't be a non-state struggle, even as it seeks to transcend the nation state. We have to defeat the hydra that is global capital, or else no autonomous zone, no liberated region is going to be safe. This is the struggle of our time, and we have a world to win. I'm going to link to the Substack article where I discuss this, and to my Patreon, if you'd be so kind to donate. I'd very much appreciate it. Thanks, and have a good day.